Now, on to what ethics is, since we've spent so much time discussing what ethics is not. This is, of course, only one possible moral theory. There are plenty of others, and I'll be happy to examine others as they are presented to me. But this is the one which I mostly agree with in the broad sense, because it matches well with how I think human beings actually do make moral decisions, ideally. So we need to answer the question of what exactly is an ethical judgment. Or, perhaps on a related note, how can we tell who is living ethically, who is living according to some ethical standard, and who is not? Well, we might start out by finding people who think that certain actions are wrong, and finding out who does not have such thoughts at all. And then we could make the separation by that criteria, that the people who think certain actions are right or wrong have some ethical standard, and the people who don't do not have this ethical standard. But the problem is it's very easy in this approach to blend together two different questions. Whether somebody has the conventional ethical standards held by their society, that's one question. Another is whether they have some ethical standard at all. There may very well be people with unconventional ethical standards who could still be said to have such standards, so long as they are prepared to justify their standards rationally or otherwise. For example, it is quite possible that a person could ethically justify lying and cheating and stealing and be entirely consistent with their own standard. I would think that they're wrong to do so, but that is something that needs to be argued. That is not to say that they have no ethical code at all. It's just that I think their ethical code is incorrect. Of course, now that we've said that these ethical codes need some kind of justification, we should figure out what kinds of justifications would really qualify as ethical ones. A purely self-interested self-justification for a particular action can't really be said to be an ethical justification at all. The way that we define ethics, it needs to be somehow universal. It has to do equally with me and with everybody else. So to say that I should do some action simply because it benefits me, while it may be smart, isn't saying anything about the ethics of that particular action. This idea has been expressed by numerous different schools of moral philosophy in different ways, and although they disagree on details, they'll agree that an ethical viewpoint is one which views situations in some sense impartially, without taking into account the specific persons involved. This universality, however, is insufficient to derive an ethical theory, because if it's taken in the broad sense of simply saying that it has to be universal somehow, then it allows for a whole bunch of different mutually contradictory ethical theories, and no way of deciding which one is correct. But if we were to go in and redefine universality so that it only points to one particular theory, it would be very easy to make the accusation that we're smuggling our own opinion into the definition that we made of what is moral. But, although we can't get to a robust ethical theory merely by this universalist perspective, we can get to, in a broad sense, a form of utilitarianism. The form of utilitarianism that we can get to is best defined by the following pre-ethical judgment. Suppose that we lived in a system of hunter-gatherers, and the whole tribe was out gathering food. You were one of them, and you come across a tree with luscious fruit. Now the question of what to do with the fruit, whether to eat it yourself or to share it with your tribe mates, is in some sense an ethical question because it involves both you and the other members of the tribe. Now, for this principle of universality to make sense, we have to take into account not only our own preferences of what should be done with the fruit, but also the preferences of others in the group. And they should be taken into account equally strongly. Well, this very simple idea, although it's not sufficient to answer every question, gives us at least the beginnings of preference utilitarianism. Once you begin to think about others as strongly as yourself, you can be said to be thinking ethically. But that doesn't mean it's a simple task to come up with such a system. And even the most obvious ethical choice might have unforeseen consequences that make some of their options better overall. So, for example, in our fruit discussion, you might think that the best thing to do is obviously to share the fruit with the tribe, because you either benefit yourself or you benefit everybody in the tribe, and it's an easy choice to make. But there may be unforeseen consequences. Perhaps some people in the tribe would stop looking for food altogether, knowing that they would get enough from that shared by others. And this might be harmful in its own right. So, that's not to say that we can't make ethical judgments at all, but it is to say that it isn't as though we're always going to have a perfect answer, and we're always going to foresee every consequence. We just aren't. This form of preference utilitarianism, taking into account the preferences of others, is also different from what's called classical utilitarianism, or hedonistic utilitarianism, which is all about pleasure and pain, as described by Jeremy Bentham, who created this. This form is more general, and in that sense, it is a little weaker because it's more difficult to tell what preferences we should be taking into account. But because it's more general, it can be used to describe a wider variety of ethical theories anyway. However, there are plenty of other ways to derive an ethical system which takes into account some kind of universality. For example, basing it on rights, or on justice, or on the sanctity of life, or on a whole bunch of other different values. But here we come into a form of circularity, and honestly I'm not sure how we can get around that kind of circularity. In order to choose which values we should hold, we should have some ethical theory to justify why we should hold one set of values over another in some way other than just our preferences. In other words, to move beyond preference utilitarianism, we need something additional. And whether that something is additional concepts of rights, or additional qualifications, or whatever it is, ultimately we need some way of moving past this very broad and frankly useless ethical theory. So we're just going to start with preference utilitarianism. I know it's not the only starting point we could take, but it is philosophically, I think, the simplest one. And we could use it as a starting point for the other ethical systems as well. So, ultimately, if we start with this system, we can move on to the other systems if we so choose. Of course, we need to justify which values we should have by something other than our intuitions, since we already know that our intuitions could very easily be wrong. However, we can also hold preference utilitarianism up to scrutiny, because it is possible, for example, to say that ultimately which preferences should be given license to rule over us. It is possible to say that that decision ultimately relies on pleasure and pain, and thus we're back to hedonistic utilitarianism. But there are those who would argue on the other side that there are preferences which lead to pain, but which nonetheless are good things to strive for. For example, the preference for a stronger community may lead to some pain, but it may be better. And we can have these arguments back and forth all we want within utilitarianism itself. And that's not even getting into the other ethical theories. So, although we're going to start with preference utilitarianism, it is by no means an endpoint. It is not sufficient by itself. This one principle of taking into account everybody's preferences, it's not specific enough to describe what we should do in every situation. We need more layered on top of it. Of course, we'll be taking into account other ethical theories along the way, but preference utilitarianism is our starting point. Before I leave you, I'm just going to sum up what I think ethics is from my own professional viewpoint. I haven't discussed really what I do professionally, but ultimately what I do is I solve optimization problems. And to me, ethics is a heuristic for solving a very vague and, frankly, poorly defined optimization problem. Whether that problem is maximizing the happiness of others, or maximizing preferences, or meeting certain constraints on what human behavior should be, that's up to us to decide, and I think arguments can be made for all of these different things. But ultimately, I think we need to start with thinking clearly about what we mean by these things, and what principles would best serve our values. So, that's it for this video. Next time I'll go into the principle of equality, which is one of the simpler principles that might be called universal ethically. And we'll see what that has to do with how we derive ethics next time. This is the Erudite Carnophile signing off.